Oh, hello. Sorry, I must not have heard you come in. Welcome to my home. I was just relaxing this evening, sitting by the fire, reading one of my favorite books, Bleachers by John Grisham. Hey, why don't you stay? Come on in, join me. Let's read. Chapter 1, Tuesday. The road to Rakefield ran beside the school, past the old band hall and tennis courts, through a tunnel of 2 perfect rows of red and yellow maples, planted and paid for by the boosters. Then over a small hill to a lower area covered with enough asphalt for 1,000 cars. The road stopped in front of an immense gate of brick and wrought iron that announced the presence of Rakefield. And beyond the gate was a chain-link fence that encircled the hallowed ground. On Friday nights, the entire town of Messina waited for the gate to open, then rushed to the bleachers where seats were claimed and nervous pregame rituals were followed. The black, paved pasture around Rakefield would overflow long before the opening kickoff, sending the out-of-town traffic into the dirt roads and alleys and remote parking zones behind the school's cafeteria and baseball field. Opposing fans had a rough time in Messina, but not nearly as rough as the opposing team. Driving slowly along the road to Rakefield was Neely Crenshaw. Slowly because he had not been back in many years. Slowly because when he saw the lights of the field, the memories came roaring back, as he knew they would. He rolled through the red and yellow maples, bright in their autumn foliage. Their trunks had been a foot thick in Neely's glory days, and now their branches touched above him, and their leaves dropped like snow and covered the road to Rakefield. It was late in the afternoon in October, and a soft wind from the north chilled the air. He stopped his car near the gate and stared at the field. All movements were slow now. All thoughts weighed heavily with sounds and images of one another. When he played, the field had no name. None was needed. Every person in Messina knew it simply as the field. "The boys are on the field early this morning," they would say at the cafes downtown. "What time are we cleaning up the field?" they would ask at the Rotary Club. "Rake says we need a new visitors' bleachers at the field," they would say at the boosters' meeting. "Rake's got 'em on the field late tonight," they would say at the beer joints north of town. No piece of ground in Messina was more revered than the field. Not even the cemetery. After Rake left, they named it after him. Neely was gone by then, of course, long gone with no plans to return. Why he was returning now wasn't completely clear. But deep in his soul, he'd always known this day would come. The day somewhere out there in the future when he was called back. He had always known that Rake would eventually die. And of course there would be a funeral with hundreds of former players packed around the casket, all wearing their Spartan green, all mourning the loss of a legend they loved and hated. But he told himself many times that he would never return to the field as long as Rake was alive. In the distance, behind the visitor stands, were 2 practice fields, one with lights. No other school in the state had such a luxury, but then no other town worshipped its football as thoroughly and collectively as Messina. Neely could hear a coach's whistle and the thump and grunts of bodies hitting each other as the last Spartan team got ready for Friday night. He walked through the gate and across the track, painted dark green, of course. The end zone grass was manicured and suitable for putting, but there were a few wild sprigs inching up the goalpost. And there was a patch or 2 of weeds in one corner, and now that he'd noticed, Neely looked even closer and saw untrimmed growth along the edge of the track. In the glory days, dozens of volunteers gathered every Thursday afternoon and combed the field with gardening shears, snipping out every wayward blade of grass. The glory days were gone. They left with Rake. Now Massena football was played by mortals, and the town had lost its swagger. Coach Rake had once cursed loudly at a well-dressed gentleman who committed the sin of stepping onto the sacred Bermuda grass of the field. The gentleman backtracked quickly, then walked around the sideline, and when he drew closer, Rake realized he had just cursed the mayor of Massena. The mayor was offended, of course. Rake didn't care. No one walked on his field. The mayor, unaccustomed to being cursed, set in motion an ill-fated effort to fire Rake, who merely shrugged it off. The locals defeated the mayor 4-1 as soon as his name appeared on the next ballot. In those days, Eddie Rake had more political clout in Massena than all the politicians combined, and he thought nothing of it. Neely stuck to the sideline and slowly made his way toward the homestands. Then he stopped cold and took a deep breath as the pregame jitters hit him hard. The roar of a long-ago crowd came back, a crowd packed tightly together up there in the bleachers, with a band in the center of things blaring away with its endless renditions of the Spartan fight song. And on the sideline, just a few feet away, he could see number 19, nervously warming up as the mob worshipped him. Number 19 was a high school All-American, a highly recruited quarterback with a golden arm, fast feet, plenty of size, maybe the greatest Massena ever produced. Number 19 was Nearly Crenshaw in another life. He walked a few steps along the sideline, stopped at the 50 where Rake had coached hundreds of games, and looked again at the silent bleachers where 10,000 people once gathered on Friday nights to pour their emotions upon a high school football team. The crowds were half that now, he had heard. 15 years had passed since number 19 had thrilled so many. 15 years since Neely had played on that sacred turf. How many times had he promised himself he would never do what he was now doing? How many times had he sworn he would never come back? On a practice field, in the distance, a coach blew a whistle and someone was yelling, but Neely barely heard it. Instead, he was hearing the drum corps of the band and the raspy, unforgettable voice of Mr. Bo Michael on the public address, and the deafening sound of the bleachers rattling as the fans jumped up and down. And he heard Rake bark and growl, though his coach seldom lost his cool in the heat of battle. The cheerleaders were over there, bouncing, chanting, short skirts, tights, tanned and firm legs. Neely had his pick back then. His parents sat on the 40, 8 rows down from the press box. He waved at his mother before every kickoff. She spent most of the game in prayer, certain he would break his neck. The college recruits got passes to a row of chair-backed seats on the 50, prime seating. Someone once counted 38 scouts for the Garnet Central game, all there to watch number 19. Over 100 colleges wrote letters, his father still kept them. 31 offered full scholarships. When Neely signed with Tech, there was a press conference and headlines. 10,000 seats up in the bleachers for a town with a population of 8,000. The math had never worked. But they piled in from the county, from out in the sticks, where there was nothing else to do on a Friday night. They got their paycheck, bought their beer, and came to town to the field, where they clustered in one raucous pack at the north end of the stands and made more noise than the students, the band, and the townfolk combined. When he was a boy, his father had kept him away from the north end. Those country people, down there were drinking and sometimes fighting, and they often yelled foul language at the officials. A few years later, number 19 adored the racket made by those county people, and they certainly adored him. The bleachers were silent now, waiting. He moved slowly down the sideline, hands stuck deep in his pockets, a forgotten hero whose star had faded so quickly. The Massena quarterback for 3 seasons. Over 100 touchdowns. He'd never lost on this field. The games came back to him, though he tried to block them out. Those days were gone, he told himself for the 100th time. Long gone. In the south end zone, the Boosters had erected a giant scoreboard, and mounted around it on large white placards with bold green lettering was the history of Massena football, and thus the history of the town. Undefeated seasons in 60 and 61, when Rake was not yet 30 years old. Then in 1964, the streak began, with perfect seasons for the rest of that decade and into the next. A month after Neely was born in 1970, Massena lost to South Wayne in the state championship, and the streak was over. 84 wins in a row, a national record at that time, and Eddie Rake was a legend at the age of 39. Neely's father had told him of the unspeakable gloom that engulfed the town in the days after that loss. As if 84 straight victories were not enough. It was a miserable winter, but Massena endured. Next season, Rake's boys went 13-0 and slaughtered South Wayne for the state title. Other state championships followed in 74, 75, and 79. Then the drought. From 80 until 87, Neely's senior year, Massena went undefeated each season, easily won its conference and playoffs, only to lose in the state finals. There was discontent in Massena. The locals in the coffee shops were not happy. The old-timers longed for the days of the streak. Some school in California won 90 in a row, and the entire town of Massena was offended. To the left of the scoreboard, on green placards with white lettering, were the tributes to the greatest of all Massena heroes. 7 numbers had been retired, with Neely's 19 being the last. Next to it was the number 56, worn by Jesse Trapp, a linebacker who played briefly at Miami, then went to prison. In 1974, Rake had retired number 81, worn by Roman Armstead, the only Massena Spartan to play in the NFL. Beyond the south end zone was a field house that any small college would envy. It had a weight room and lockers and a visitor's dressing room with carpet and showers. It too was built by the Boosters after an intense capital campaign that lasted one winter and consumed the entire town. No expense was spared, not for the Massena Spartans football team. Coach Rake wanted weights and lockers and coaches' offices, and the Boosters practically forgot about Christmas. There was something different now, something Neely had not seen before. Just past the gate that led to the field house, there was a monument with a brick base and a bronze bust on it. Neely walked over to take a look. It was Rake, an oversized Rake with wrinkles on the forehead and the familiar scowl around the eyes, yet just a hint of a smile. He wore the same weathered Massena cap he'd worn for decades, a bronze Eddie Rake at 50, not the old man of 70. Under it was a plaque with a glowing narrative, including the details that almost anyone on the streets of Massena could rattle off from memory. 34 years as coach of the Spartans, 418 wins, 62 losses, 13 state titles, and from 1964 to 1970, an undefeated streak that ended at 84 games. It was an altar, and Neely could see the Spartans bowing before it as they made their way onto the field each Friday night. The wind picked up and scattered leaves in front of Neely. Practice was over, and the soiled and sweaty players were trudging toward the field house. He didn't want to be seen, so he walked down the track and through a gate. He climbed up 30 rows and sat all alone in the bleachers high above Rake Field with a view of the valley to the east. Church steeples rose above the gold and scarlet trees of Messina in the distance. The steeple on the far left belonged to the Methodist Church, and a block behind it, unseen from the bleachers, was a handsome 2-story home the town had given to Eddie Rake on his 50th birthday. And in that home was Miss Lila and her 3 daughters, and all the rest of the Rakes were now gathered, waiting for the coach to take his last breath. No doubt the house was full of friends too, with trays of food covering the tables and flowers stacked everywhere. Were any former players there? Neely thought not. If you'd like to know more about Coach Rake and the Messina Spartans, I highly recommend you pick up Bleachers by John Grisham.